Welcome to another edition of the MMA Lockcast. I'm your host, Manpreet, aka MMA Lock of the Night, and your boy on social media at MMALOTN. This week, a double header of Lockcast episodes for you guys. That's always the case whenever PFL comes to town, and they do have their 7th event of the year going down, and it is the semifinals for the middleweights, light heavyweights, and heavyweights. And then we have a couple other feature bouts sprinkled out throughout the card. I believe we also have a bantamweight #1 contender fight between Rafael Stots and Sergio Pettis, who I've heard is rumored to fight the winner of the bantamweight tournament this year. So high stakes matchup there between two former Bellator champions. All in all, there are 9 fights on this PFL 7 card. It goes down on Friday. Getting it out for you guys nice and early here on a Tuesday, but it's also because I have a ton of other work to do for the rest of the week. We got 2 Cage Warriors cards as well as an OKTAGON card going down this weekend. I'll have breakdowns on YouTube for both the Cage Warriors cards the day before their events, so one on Thursday and then one on Friday, and then I'll only have written breakdowns for the OKTAGON event, which goes down Saturday morning, and that will strictly be on the Lock of the Night Patreon page, which is also where you can find all the track plays, degenerate plays, props, in-depth breakdowns on all these fights from the PFL to the UFC to all the other promotions that I cover. So make sure you guys check out the MMA LOTN Patreon page. And you don't have to sign up for the month. There are now options that you can just purchase a post, specifically the final plays and predictions post, which I normally do either the morning of the fights or the day before the fight. So for this PFL card, I'll have my final plays and predictions post out for you guys probably by Friday morning / afternoon. And that's when you guys can check out the Patreon page and get it there, or just sign up for the month and get everything, including those posts as well. All right, without further ado, let's get right into this 9-fight card. The first one up, I believe, is going to be a light heavyweight alternate belt where we have Xavier coming in at -155, going up against Albrektsson, who comes in at +125. Now, starting off on the Xavier side of things, I was so close to cashing him as a +350 underdog back in September when he went up against Powell in his PFL debut. This is a guy that started his career 7-6 and then went on a 7-1 run leading into that Powell fight, showcasing he is much better than that start indicated. He is a BJJ black belt, but also has a very slick Muay Thai approach where he's been able to pick opponents apart. But the issue I've had with him in the past is his urgency at times allows fights to slip through his fingers. Specifically that Powell fight where he dropped Powell numerous times in that first round, but then let his foot off the gas in the second and third rounds, allowing Powell to fight back into it and then end up picking up the win over Xavier. He's going up against a tough Albrektsson, who's largely been underperforming in his last couple of fights. I believe he's now 1-4 over his last 5 fights, but this is a guy that has the skill set to be very competitive with the top of this division in the PFL roster. You're talking about a guy that has a win, or nearly had a win, over Yuri Prochazka several years back, but also has an October 2021 win over last year's PFL light heavyweight champion Dovlet Yagshimuradov. When Albrektsson is at his best, he utilizes his grappling, clinch work, and normally likes to push his opponents up against the cage until he finds that opening to take them to the ground, where he normally showcases heavy top pressure. Normally his submission defense is on point, and he does a good job in terms of keeping his opponents on their back. And he's really a wild card in terms of being successful in the cage. Either he's a big miss like he was against Powell last time around, or he's a big hit like he was against Dovlet Yagshimuradov, where he was able to accrue that control, dictate the pace, and really grind that fight out. And at +125, it's hard not to want to take a shot on him here against Xavier, who, like I said, kind of lets fights slip through his fingers at times. Sure, Xavier will have the striking advantage, but Albrektsson might be able to nullify that by crowding his space, pushing him up against the cage, dragging him to the ground for a couple takedowns, and maybe getting some proper control time. If his cardio looks good, if he looks like he's dialed in, this could look like a pretty solid steal at +125. So I'm going to go Albrektsson here, and Albrektsson by decision. All right, next up, the first semifinal for the heavyweight division. We got Oleg Popov, which was last year's finalist, coming in at minus 230, going up against Rodrigo Nascimento, who comes in at plus 190. Now, starting off on the Popov side, it was a little bit greasier than I expected it to be when he took on Carl Williams last time around in the opening bout of the heavyweight tournament. That was a fight that I thought he clearly won the first round, but the second and third rounds, it was harder for him to get the takedowns, and he was still applying the pressure with pushing Carl Williams up against the cage. I just wish he did a little bit more in terms of damage so that he can actually make it look more of a clear win for him. There's a lot of cases that Carl Williams probably should have won that fight, and I would tend to agree with them, but I think that was Popov at his worst. This is a guy with a solid 20-2 record. He's very effective when he can get into his clinch groove, and even if he doesn't land takedowns, he's normally good in terms of shoving his forehead into the chin of his opponent to pin them up against the cage and then start to get to work with some dirty boxing and some knees up the middle. His cardio normally looks on point, and he's very difficult to deal with and frustrating to deal with when he gets into that clinch cage mode, that groove of just getting that cage clinch going and then mixing a couple level changes and takedowns as well. Now, he's going up against former UFC fighter Rodrigo Nascimento, who just inched past Abraham Babli in his opening bout as well. That was a close fight. I thought similar to the issues that Popov had, Babli was unable to have success after that first round because it seemed like he started to slow down. It seemed like Nascimento was finally able to start pushing away from him, getting into open space, and letting go with some combination striking, which often caused Babli a ton of trouble. Not to mention, Babli is crazy undersized for this matchup. I know he has thunder thighs and all, but still, you're not going to be able to get over the hump in this heavyweight division at that size, especially as you start taking steps up in competition. Now, Nascimento is a guy that's, kind of... I used to think he had a high ceiling, but it's starting to look like he's more so of a mediocre fighter. He's a BJJ black belt, if I'm not mistaken, but doesn't show that much urgency in terms of the clinch or his takedowns. He wants to let go with his combination striking and try to dictate the pace that way, but if he really can't get on his forward foot, he often falls victim to what his opponents want to implement, and he often just goes with the flow and allows him to take control. And I think that's the issues he's going to have here against Popov, who should do a good enough job in terms of pinning Nascimento up against the cage and grinding him out from that position. I know Popov, kind of struggled against Carl Williams, but I don't think he's facing as difficult of a test here in Nascimento. And Nascimento, we've already seen him get grinded out up against that cage against a guy like Babli, but I think Popov will be more successful with it for longer periods of time, which will ultimately shut down Nascimento's game, leading to Popov winning this fight on the scorecards. All right. Bit of a showcase bout here. I'm going to glide over this one quickly. Biagio Ali Walsh coming in at minus 1,500, going up against Ronnie Gibbs, who comes in at plus 600, I believe it is. But not a good fight. Obviously, this is a spot for Walsh to just run over his opposition. I know Gibbs was 7-1 as an amateur, picked up his first pro win when he turned pro earlier this year, but he's had a lot of gaps in between a lot of his fights as of late, and going up against a stud like Ali Walsh, I know we're going to see Walsh get a lot of layups through his first couple of fights, probably not until the 6th, maybe 7th fight in his pro career. We finally will get to see what his ceiling is and what he'll look like against legit resistance. Here, I expect him to go out there and squash Gibbs pretty quickly and win this fight by knockout. All right. The other semifinal for the heavyweight tournament now is going to be Valentin Moldavsky coming in at minus 175, going up against Alexander Romanov, who comes in at plus 135. Now, after starting his career 11-1 and winning the Bellator heavyweight title, I've constantly found myself saying that Moldavsky underperforms in a lot of his fights. That's why he's 2-2 over his last 4 fights, I believe it was. But he's just losing twice to Linton Vassell. There's that third round where he was having some good success at the beginning of it and then got reversed, and it kind of just seemed like he gave up on himself at that point. Even last time around against Sergey Bilostini, a controversial decision there. I thought Moldavsky showed some decent things, but needed to show a little bit more urgency, and I think that's going to be his issue here against a guy like Alexander Romanov. But quickly finishing off on the Moldavsky side, he can grapple when he needs to. He has some decent boxing as well, some good leg kicks, but it's just that lack of urgency at times that has allowed other fights to slip through his fingers. Now, he's going up against Alexander Romanov, who was nothing but a finisher. Through his first 16 pro fights, he had never gone a full 15 minutes, and I think that's why the UFC had initially signed him. But then after a decision loss to Marcin Tybura back in August of 2022, he ended up going to a decision in his next 2 of 4 fights, but both of those wins were, both of those 2 fights that went to the scorecards were fights that he ended up winning, and it seemed like he started to change his style of fighting from being more of a, King Kong smasher, I believe that was his nickname, looking to take guys to the ground immediately and smash them from that top position, to now just utilizing the threat of the takedown to set up the rest of his striking game so he can dictate the pace, start walking opponents down, landing some leg kicks, landing some power shots, but just being very tepid-paced about it so he doesn't end up blowing his gas tank. That's last time around, luckily, he didn't have to worry about that. He was able to catch Timothy Johnson in a guillotine right from jump and was able to force the tap within about a minute and a half there. But now he's going up against a tougher opponent in Valentin Moldavsky. Now, going into this, I really expected to pick the Moldavsky side, as I thought that he was the better overall fighter, and he probably is. But I think the aggressiveness that Romanov could bring to this fight with his power shots and maybe even some takedown attempts, because I think if he goes for takedowns, he could complete them here against Moldavsky, and I think he could even grind out some top position time. But again, Romanov, a bit of a wild card at times as well, and I think this will be the best fighter, obviously the best fighter he's faced since leaving the UFC, since almost any heavyweight is better than Timothy Johnson at this point. But I'm going to wait and see if this line grows a little bit more. Currently, it's at plus 135. I want to see if it ends up, hitting that plus 160, plus 170 range as more people start to jump in on Moldavsky. Again, Moldavsky might be the better overall fighter, but Romanov's ability to just apply himself, push that pressure, and maybe just take the momentum away from Moldavsky could allow this fight to look more in favor of Romanov if it ends up hitting the scorecards, which I think it ends up doing. So I'm going to go Romanov here, Romanov by decision, but I'm going to wait for this line to see if it ends up ballooning some more, then I'll probably pull the trigger. Otherwise, I don't mind passing on it. All right, next up. In the first semifinal in the light heavyweight division, we got Antonio Carlos Jr. coming in at plus 120, going up against Simeon Powell, who comes in at minus 150. Now, starting off on the ACJ side of things, he's trying to add a second PFL title to his mantle after winning the 2021 season. He's had a few issues that have kept him out of action, but he did have a solid victory last time around over Carl Moore, I should say. It actually went to a split decision, a very close fight. I thought it still was clear that ACJ won the first 2 rounds. It was clear that he was starting to slow down in the third and Moore was starting to land a little bit more damage. But that's kind of the case with ACJ. Either he utilizes his high-level BJJ from jump, utilizing his physicality and his strength to slam opponents to the ground and then crush his way to a dominant position, or he just rides these positions out until it gets too late, and then he starts to slow down and tries to cling on for dear life. And, his striking leaves a lot to be desired. It normally just throws big power punches to eventually close the distance and try to get into the clinch and then eventually a takedown. But if he's forced to strike for long periods of time, that's where we often see him start to come up short. Now, he's going up against a guy in Simeon Powell whose only loss came against Jakob Neto in the 2023 season of the PFL Europe season, I guess it was. A fight that he got knocked out in, but he did manage to bounce back last time over Rafael Xavier. Close fight, but I was impressed with his ability to battle back from adversity, especially after getting dropped a few times in that first round. Powell, at his best, is a guy that likes to utilize that distance striking game, a crisp jab down the pipe. He loves to utilize that calf kick as well to debilitate his opponents. And if he feels he has a big enough grappling edge over his opponents, he'll look to take them to the ground and smash them from that top position as well. This is going to be his toughest test in terms of a grapple-heavy threat, but I think Powell will be up to it. I think we'll see ACJ try to get some takedowns early, but I think he'll struggle. I think Powell will work immediately back to his feet if he does end up getting taken down. And I think we see ACJ start to slow down going into the second round, and that's where the finishing opportunities for Powell will start to show themselves. Look for Powell to start picking ACJ apart in the second round and then getting that KO finish to stamp himself a finals appearance later on this year. All right. Moving over to the middleweight semifinal that we got here. It's between Dalton Rosta, who comes in at -125, going up against Aaron Jeffery, who comes in at +105. Now, this is a rematch of a fight that took place under the Bellator banner back in August of 2023, and that was a night where Jeffery was able to pull out after the second and third rounds and really start wearing Rosta down and winning that fight on the scorecards. Starting off on the Rosta side of things, he is now 2-1 since that initial meeting between the two, and the last win that he had was a dominant victory over Sadabu C in a fight where he was able to hurt C on the feet, take him to the ground, and then eventually find a submission in that second round to force the tap from the former PFL champion. Rosta has often leaned on his physicality and his wrestling to try to get opponents to the ground and then dominate them from that top position, but it seems like he's really starting to round out his striking game because he knows he needs to really fill that gap because he can't be desperation grappling, especially when his gas tank starts running on empty, because he found out what that could do to him, especially in his last matchup against Aaron Jeffery. Now, Jeffery is now 2-1 since that victory over Dalton Rosta. That one loss coming to Fabian Edwards, who ended up getting a title shot after that. But we did see Jeffery utilize a ton of his grind against Murad Ramazanov last time around, where both guys were, just trying to jockey for position in that clinch. It often looked like Ramazanov going for a takedown, which he was able to complete 7 of, but Jeffery did not settle on bottom position at all. He quickly worked back to his feet, and that's where we eventually saw Jeffery reverse the position and then start chipping away at Ramazanov, more than doubling him on total strikes that night, and then winning just, it was a split decision, but it was clear that Jeffery was more focused on landing damage compared to Ramazanov, who was just trying to complete takedowns. And that's Jeffery's game. He wants to bully opponents in the clinch. Sometimes he looks for takedowns. Other times he's fine with just roughing them up against the cage, pushing them up against the cage, landing some dirty boxing, some knees, just staying very active and often dishing out damage and trying to just break and wear his opponents down. Now, I'm kind of surprised that Jeffery still finds himself as the underdog in this fight. In the first fight, he came in as a +145 underdog. Now against Dalton Rosta the second time, he's at +105. Now, I think people might be reading into some of the improvements in Rosta's game, which is more so him being a little bit more confident in his hands, but I think he's going to struggle to get off on that type of offense as Jeffery continues to tie up with him, push him against the cage, and slow him down just as he did last time around. Rosta may show some improvements and may show a little bit better of a game, especially down the stretch. But I think for the most part, this will be Jeffery utilizing his pressure, his pace, and his cardio advantage to really wear Rosta down, grind this fight out, and give us a classic Aaron Jeffery performance, pulling off the upset here. All right. We got our bantamweight showcase bout now between former champion Sergio Pettis coming in at +240, going up against Rafael Stots, who comes in at -280. Now, starting off on the Pettis side of things, it was very unfortunate to see him actually leave the UFC after a 9-5 record, and then he ended his stretch with the promotion with a 2-3 run, although those losses came to guys like Henry Cejudo, Rob Font, and Jussier Formiga. But he did a very good job in terms of when he decided to jump over to Bellator, won the bantamweight title, went up against former UFC fighter Kyoji Horiguchi in his first title defense, and that was a fight that I thought he was losing about 3.5 rounds of until he ended up landing that nasty spinning back fist that dropped Horiguchi and forced a stop to the fight. But since then, it's not been the greatest. Or actually, he did defeat Patricio Pitbull when Pitbull was trying to look for a third title in a third division. But then he went up against Patchy Mix. Mix was able to take him down and submit him in the second round. And then he went up against Kyoji Horiguchi in a rematch under the Risen banner. And that's where we saw Horiguchi rinse and repeat what he did in the first fight, but not get knocked out this time. And Horiguchi was able to grind him out and win that fight. And that's where it seems to show the flaws in Pettis' game. He's a very fun and crafty striker who throws a lot of flashy unorthodox techniques, and does a decent job of managing his range at times and utilizing some solid speed. But when he's facing a heavy grappler and wrestler, that's where we often see him play defense and have to fight off his back. And there are some times where his takedown defense does not look all that great. And unfortunately for him, he's going up against a very solid wrestler here in Raufeon Stots, who really jumped on people's radars when he was able to pull off that big upset victory over Magomedov. Last time around, we saw him pick up back-to-back victories over Danny Sabatello and Marcos Breno, both fights where he showcased his wrestling to a T and showcased how he's still one of the best bantamweights on the PFL roster. He has a 21-2 record with his only 2 losses coming to Merab Dvalishvili and Patchy Mix, both knockout losses, very early knockout losses. I think the Dvalishvili one was less than a minute, and then the Mix one was less than 90 seconds. But when he doesn't get knocked out quickly, he's always won. He's gone out there, applied his grind, applied his wrestling, and managed to break these opponents and come out on top. I expect him to do the same thing here against Pettis. I don't think he finishes him, but I think he gains enough control time, lands enough damage from that top position, and really thwarts the offense of Pettis here, allowing Stots to go out there and grind this fight out on the scorecards. I do not mind Stots as a possible parlay piece here either, and I think he makes it look pretty convincing, especially in the second and third rounds. All right. The second semifinal for the light heavyweight division sees former Bellator champion Phil Davis coming in at minus 260, going up against Sullivan Cauley, who comes in at plus 220. Now, starting off on the Davis side of things, I did fade him last time around as he was coming off a 2-year-long layoff, 40 years old. Going up against a superior striker in Rob Wilkinson and a guy that had good enough takedown defense to keep Davis away from his wrestling game. And that was looking pretty true for the first round as Wilkinson touched up Davis and showed him who the superior fighter was. But there was a little bit of a change in between rounds for Phil Davis, and realizing that if he just stepped a little bit more into the pocket and threw his big shots, he'd be able to land those big spots on Wilkinson. And that came through within the first minute of that second round as he knocked out the former PFL champion and stamped his way into the semifinal. Now, Phil Davis is a guy that has a decent wrestling background, but often seems to lean on his striking now. And it seems with the confidence that's starting to grow with him, even at 40 years old, he could still be very competitive and quite dominant, and may even find himself as the favorite to win this whole thing. Now, he's going up against Sullivan Cauley, who doesn't have nearly as much experience as Phil Davis does. And he was actually supposed to fight BJJ black belt Marcelo Nunes last time around. But after Nunes was forced out of that fight, Cauley had to take the alternate in Alex Polizzi. And Polizzi got to the wrestling immediately, which is normally what Cauley tries to implement against his opponents. But as Cauley started to stuff the takedowns and keep Polizzi from settling from that top position, it was the last takedown attempt from Polizzi where Cauley finally started landing those Travis Brown-style elbows to hurt Polizzi and force a stoppage to that fight. Now that's, 8 pro fights for Cauley, which have all finished in round 1. This guy's never seen the second round. This guy constantly either gets finished in the first round, which I believe he's only lost 1 fight, which was to Luke Traynor, or he's just going out there and smushing his competition. He's very athletic, very powerful, very explosive, but there is a solid question mark in terms of what it looks like when he can't establish that dominance early, and if he can battle back from adversity if his usual game plan does not go to play. And that's really going to be tested here against Phil Davis, who has the wrestling to shut that down in Cauley's game if that's what Cauley looks to implement. And I think that Davis will showcase he's the superior striker, and I think as he fends off the first few takedowns, he'll be able to separate himself, get some open cage time, and from there I think he lands those big shots, which eventually puts Cauley away. So I do like Davis here. I think he probably wins this within a round and a half, and I think he looks, after stuffing the first few takedowns, I think he makes it look quite easy after he starts letting go with the strikes and picks up the win here. All right. That brings us to the main event now, as we have Fabian Edwards coming in at minus 600 going up against Josh Silveira, who comes in at plus 450. Now, last time around, Edwards took on Impa Kasanganay, a former PFL champion, and I think a lot of people, even though the odds were kind of close, I think Edwards was roughly around plus 120. I think a lot of people thought it would just be a routine classic Kasanganay fight where he just chips away at his opponents, maybe incorporates a little bit of clinch and a few takedowns. But after Kasanganay showcased that he wanted to get the fight down to the ground immediately, and Edwards was able to stuff all of those and start to dictate the pace in the striking realm, that's where a lot of people started figuring out that, hey, Edwards is way more alive in this matchup than people were making it seem. And then Edwards eventually found that second round finish as Kasanganay started to break, as his clinch approach did not work out for him, and Edwards was able to stamp his spot in the semifinal here. Normally he showcases a good striking approach. He can even grapple if he needs to, but more often than not, he is most comfortable letting his hands go, letting his combinations go, and hurting opponents from distance. He goes up against Josh Silveira, who I think we've really seen the ceiling on as of late. You know, he's a guy that's came up short twice now against Impa Kasanganay, but now he came out on top in the opening round against Mike Shipman in a fight that was 2-1 on the scorecards, and, you know, kind of showing you further the ceiling of Silveira. You know, he has been kind of propped up to be this guy that is, the new age of mixed martial artists, because his brother, or not his brother, his father actually competed for the UFC way back in the day, and is actually one of the head coaches over there at American Top Team. And Silveira has spent his entire life pretty much training mixed martial arts, went to university for wrestling, but it's really not translating at the higher levels in the PFL ranks, coming up short against Impa Kasanganay, and I think that it'll showcase here once again against Edwards. I think if Silveira is not able to get the takedowns, which I don't think is going to come through, then he'll be at the mercy of Edwards' striking advantage. At minus 600, is it worth it? Maybe Silveira lands a takedown or two. Maybe he's able to finagle his way to a win here. But I think for the most part, I think Edwards chips away at him and wins a decision. But I don't know if I'd be willing to part ways at minus 600. If we get some Silveira love to come in, bring him down closer to that minus 300 range, maybe I'd be a little bit more keen to take a shot on him there or throw him in a parlay at that point. Otherwise, I'm fine with passing on this matchup. I think Edwards wins. I think he makes it look good enough to win this fight on the scorecards. There you guys go. PFL semifinals, PFL World Tournament 7. They got so many different names for these PFL cards. Just make it more simple. Regardless, I believe this is the last event for their semifinals. And then next week is actually PFL MENA 2 and PFL Europe 2, which take place on back-to-back days. And then the PFL Championships does not start until, I believe, August 1st. So a little bit of a layoff there. Reminder, UFC going down this weekend as well. I already got that breakdown out for you guys, dropping all the segments as I normally do. Cage Warriors ×2, 2 events going down this weekend, and then the OKTAGON. I'll have all those breakdowns for you guys on the MMALOTN Patreon page. Check the link in the description below. Otherwise, I'll see you guys actually later today. It's going to be quite late, but I'll be dropping the chalk or not segment for you guys as well. See you guys then. Peace.
Last thing.